turn things over to Scott Holland.
Thanks, Jason. It's so good to see many old friends, many familiar faces, and enter into conversation with you this morning on Theopoetics. I'm coming to you this morning from our place in Yellow Springs, Ohio. My wife Sherry and I left our home in Pittsburgh this weekend to visit her mother, who is in assisted living in Orrville, Ohio, then came down to Yellow Springs to make sure that our place here hadn't been taken over by raccoons and old hippies in our absence, and everything is well here. This place is really my writing studio, and it is the former original African-American tavern of the village. So there's lots of space, and it's a very inviting place to be. And this morning, I want to talk to you about how Theopoetics can likewise be a very inviting place. At Bethany, we're finding our new programs in Theopoetics are rapidly expanding, attracting students literally now from around the world. We currently have one of our Nigerian students who is interested in the Masters in Theopoetics and Writing. We have a certificate, a graduate certificate in Theopoetics and the Theological Imagination, and a number of students have already taken that certificate and earned credit in that area. Some have stayed on for the full master's degree in Theopoetics and Writing. This is a newer master's program, and this spring we will have our first graduates with the MA in Theopoetics and Writing. So this morning, I want to talk with you about why there is such an interest in Theopoetics, at least from my perspective, and from the confessions and testimonies of a number of our students. We're finding in this program that we have centrists, we have progressives, we have traditionalists who are coming together and finding some common ground around what we're calling Theopoetics. So this morning, I want to talk about a number of things. First of all, I want to talk about what is Theopoetics, because I'm sure some of you are unfamiliar with the term. And in so doing, I want to talk about how and why we feel that by creating greater linguistic space or more hospitable linguistic space, we can build more inclusive and expansive communities of faith. Again, how providing much more hospitable and expansive linguistic space can contribute to more inclusive and expansive communities of faith. This is one of the things that we accent in Theopoetics. And then for your specific interests, I hope, given the fact that this is the E-Town Church of the Brethren, I want to suggest that Theopoetics is a rather organic outgrowth of the movement of radical pietism and pietism, that the early pietists found themselves expressing their faith much more often in poetry than in doctrinal propositions, more often in the lyricism of hymnody than in confessional classical creeds of the church, and in a kind of devotional writing that when we look at the language of the devotional writing, it is far, far more poetic, and we would say theopoetic, than it is theological. So hopefully we'll cover some of that territory. I want to provide a lot of room for conversation and discussion. So I'll be moving through some things rather quickly, and then we can return to some of those things in our conversation together. So one of our graduates of the certificate program, we didn't have the full MA program at the time, is Wendy McFadden, our publisher at Brethren Press. And Wendy McFadden challenged me to work on being able to communicate what is theopoetics in 1,200 words or less. And I said, oh, Wendy, I think you need to do that. And she said, oh, no, you need to do that. I'm not going to give you those 1,200 words that I gave her. That appears in Messenger about 3 years ago. You can find it. But there are 3 areas that I work with for Wendy in that Messenger article that I'd like to touch upon this morning as I'm trying to communicate to you what is theopoetics. And that is mystery, metaphor, and meaning making. And so we'll look at that trajectory of mystery, metaphor, meaning making in this definition. And then we can move on to some other things like how were the early pietists in some ways theopoets. So mystery. The great Mennonite theologian and ecumenical theologian Gordon Kaufman, in his book In Face of Mystery, reminds us that both divinity and humanity are touched by an awesome and tremendous mystery. We actually do our theological work, our spiritual reflection in face of mystery. This is very much true of some of the ultimate things that we care about: God, love, how we understand the other. We are touched by mystery. And our God talk is, of course, touched by mystery. So often when talking about this, I hold up a big poster, but this morning I have a small poster. And so I ask you, what is this? Anyone? Please, what is this?
It's the word God.
It is the word God. Any other comments on what is this? Well, good. You are a mature and a savvy group. So of course, it is the word God. Often in teaching undergraduate classes, when I display the poster and ask, what is this? The answer quickly given is God. Well, of course, it's not God. It is a representation of God. It is through language, and our words are part of an expansive and intricate symbol system. It is the word God. Therefore, God in some ways we can say is a symbol for God. In some ways we can say God, that is the word, G-O-D, points to something beyond itself. And that's why the great medieval German mystic, Meister Eckhart, taught his devotees to pray at times like this: O God, beyond the God we name. O God, beyond the God we name. It's important to note that Meister Eckhart greatly influenced a number of the 16th century and 17th century Anabaptists, spiritualists, and pietists with this kind of spiritual mysticism. When we think about God as mystery, and that God is a symbol for God, that is, G-O-D is a symbol for God, we are reminded that our God is a God of many names. And so when we open our hymnal and when we sing together, God of many names, we sing that God is the womb and birth of time, the rabbi of the poor, the God of Jewish faith, the God of Jesus Christ, the web and loom of love. And in some of our hymnal supplements, we have another hymn also written by Brian Rem, and it's called Bring Many Names. Bring many names, beautiful and good, strong Mother God, warm Father God, old aching God, young growing God, great living God, never fully known, joyful darkness far beyond our seeing, closer yet than breathing. Now, when we sing this, and when we sing this in a spirit of devotion and worship, we are, in a sense, transcending all of the petite doctrinal debates about God, and we are entering a theological imagination that is far more expansive. And I hope in your congregation there at E-Town, after you sing hymns like this, that you don't pause and debate which metaphor in the end is the correct one, which linguistic symbol is the right one, and then enter into some grand theological debate that carries us beyond the mystery and the spiritual vision and voice of Theopoetics. This is what Meister Eckhart was getting at when he said, when we pray, at times we should pray, "O God, beyond the God we name." Now, this doesn't mean that we can't have a good time discussing the many metaphors for God, but in so doing, we would always want to remember that there is never one river, there is never one stream. There are many streams that flow into our understanding of this great oceanic understanding of the divine. So we would say that God may in fact be beyond the God we name, but every poet and every good preacher and every writer knows that language matters. So in another way, to name is to know and to remember. So we must take care in our naming of God and in our naming of our world, because God and the world often becomes what we signify. When we name our world, it becomes important to name it artfully, because our world becomes the world we name. Consider the profound paradox of language in this poem entitled Words by Dana Gioia. Words. I think it's a great poem, and it says far more than I can say in any kind of intellectual or academic description about words. Words. The world does not need words. It articulates itself in sunlight, leaves, and shadows. The stones on the path are no less real for lying uncatalogued and uncounted. The fluent leaves speak only the dialect of pure being. The kiss is still fully itself, though no words are spoken. And one word transforms it into something less or other, illicit, chaste, perfunctory, conjugal, covert. Even calling it a kiss betrays the fluster of hands, glancing the skin or gripping a shoulder, the slow arching of neck or knee, the silent touching of tongues. Yet the stones remain less real to those who cannot name them or read the mute syllables graven in silica. Metamorphic quartz, cousin to the flint, the Kiowa, carved as arrowheads. To name is to know and to remember. The sunlight needs no praise, piercing the rain clouds, painting the rocks and leaves with light, and then dissolving each lucent droplet back into the clouds that engendered it. The daylight needs no praise, and so we praise it always, greater than ourselves and all the airy words we summon. The world does not need words, and yet to name is to know and to remember. And if that is true, and it's true that it is difficult yet challenging to artfully name this sensuous living world around us, we need to remember how challenging yet important it can be to artfully and poetically name the divine, transcendent, spiritual, and what is often called the ineffable divine nature and presence of God. Thus, the style and substance of Theopoetics is a kind of writing, we say, that is most at home in the linguistic world of metaphor. Now, if we had more time, I would lead you in an exercise of what is a metaphor, and I would carry you all the way back to grammar school days, and we would spend 10 or 15 minutes playing with metaphor. But this is a quick summary. So you see here, I am sitting in a chair, and this chair has arms. But are they really arms? Well, the arm of a chair, the leg of this chair. Are they really arms and legs? We would say, well, yes and no. And that is the nature of metaphorical language. A metaphor declares, this is indeed the arm of a chair. And behind me, we can see the legs of this cherry table. But they're really not legs, and they're really not arms, but they are not. They are not. So a metaphor boldly says, it is, and then it whispers, but it is not. It is, but it is not. This is how we make our way through life. And I would suggest to you that this is also the way we make our way through the task of God talk, theology, or theopoetics. Let me read you a great poem by Lisa Mueller entitled Things. And it says what some theorists have taken 500 pages to communicate in books about metaphor. If you want a really good book about metaphor, it is Paul Ricoeur's The Rule of Metaphor. It's a great book, but it's thick, it's dense, it's difficult. You can read that book, or you can have a copy of this poem, and either one will make you happy, and both say, in essence, the same thing. Things. What happened is we grew lonely living among the things. So we gave the clock a face, the chair a back, the table 4 stout legs, which would never suffer fatigue. We fitted our shoes with tongues as smooth as our own and hung tongues inside bells so we could listen to their emotional language. And because we loved graceful profiles, the pitcher received a lip, the bottle a long, slender neck. Even what was beyond us was recast in our image. So we gave the country a heart, the storm an eye, the cave a mouth, so we could pass into safety. We make our way through this world by the use of metaphor. And if we make our way through mundane life using metaphors, think of how we likewise do this when we theologize or when we move into God talk. You know, often when I am out in congregations preaching, word gets out that you better watch out for this guy because he likes poetry. And oh, I hope he doesn't give us too much poetry. So often I'm met in the foyers of the church by members who say, well, good to have you here, brother, but you know, we don't much care for poetry. And I then say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry that you have such a low view of scripture here in your church, because the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That is poetry. And then they begin to stammer and stumble a bit in what they mean by that. And I also say, and I think you sing a lot of hymns here, and you enter into hymns in a spirit of worship. And our hymnody is poetry, yes. And often then they say, oh, well, if that's what you mean, then I think we like poetry. Well, that is what I mean, but the poetic is far more than simply the Psalms or our hymn book. It is really life. It is actually how we compose a life. A couple more things quickly, and then I want to leave plenty of time for conversation because I'm sure that many of you have questions or comments. As you know, some of you know anyway, I hold two different positions at Bethany Theological Seminary, which is to say that in addition to my hickory rocker, I have two chairs. One is in peace studies, and the other is in theology and culture. The Peace Studies Department has been generously endowed by the Baker Endowment, John and Elizabeth Baker, and the Theology and Culture Chair is in honor of Warren Slabaugh, former professor of theology who cared about blending the social gospel with pietism and spirituality in his work back in the old days when Bethany was in Chicago. So some wonder, how do you hold these two positions together? They seem different, like peace and justice studies and theopoetics. Well, I would suggest to you that they intersect very nicely. When I do peace work around the world, whether it's in Nigeria or Kenya or Indonesia or Colombia or Lebanon, I find that turning to theopoetics or turning to the rule of metaphor is likewise helpful in what we call conflict resolution or conflict transformation. Think about it. I mean, it's in many ways common sense, right? If someone stands up and offers a firm doctrinal proposition, it can really either invite dialogue and debate, or it can invite and often divides some conflict, some argument, and it can, in a polite space, actually shut down the conversation. Or if one stands and one offers a bold ideological political proposition, it can likewise invite dialogue and debate, or in a polite space, it can at times shut down the conversation. But if we know we are entering a space where there is already some conflict and disagreement, I have found that if we offer a poem, a parable, a story, or a song to invite first some exploration together, it's very unlikely that someone would stand up and say, I disagree with that poem. I disagree with that song. Oh, it can happen. But generally, what happens is someone might say, well, I don't know that that speaks to me and my experience. Or if it's a poem, wow, I'm not sure I get it. What do you think the second stanza is trying to communicate to us? I find that metaphorical language, poetic language, parabolic language, lyrical language tends to open up more space for exploration together, where we might come to some common ground, which then might feel like we've entered some more generous linguistic space, and maybe our hearts even feel a bit more spacious in terms of how we're looking at the other. And then we can maybe move on into some of the more difficult conversations. The third movement is meaning making. And I think in our conversation this morning, we can talk about how we make meaning. I have many examples about how we together make meaning, certainly by using sacred text, scripture, our traditions, our heritage, our human experience, and then our ability to reason together around all of these things. But I will accent one thing that we accent in the certificate program and in the full MA program, and that is the importance of the imagination. And one of the things that the Romantics understood, by the Romantics, I'm talking about that movement that evolved out of Pietism. Oh yeah, the great movement of both German and English Romanticism. Those movements have their roots in Pietism. And I've written about this and I'm writing more about it even now. And the Romantics really revered the work of the imagination in concert with reason. And this is what the Romantics believed about imagination and reason. Reason can only follow the paths that are first broken open by the imagination. If there are no new imaginative moves, there can be no new paths of reasoning together. It's a really important point. And when I'm talking about the imagination, I'm talking, of course, in this context, about the poetic imagination, the spiritual imagination, the lyrical imagination, the musical imagination, the prophetic imagination that opens up new spaces, new paths for us to reason together about and around. One more quick thing, and then some conversation. So, some of you know the name Martin Grove Brumbaugh, that leader of the Pennsylvania and actually National Brethren in other ways, that also became the governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I've been doing some work on Brumbaugh much to the dismay of some of my friends and colleagues who say, I don't know that that will carry you anywhere. And I would say their names, but I'm not going to. You know who they are. You know who they are. They've written about him and against him. Well, when I've asked many who have known more about Brumbaugh than I, did he do much with poetry? This is when I was first beginning to investigate him. The response was, no, he wrote that book on the history of the German Baptist Brethren, which isn't a very good book after all. And he wrote a lot of books about educational theory, because that's what he was about, not only in his role as president of Juniata, but in his political roles and appointments as well. And so, yeah. So I asked far and wide about this, and I looked at many of his writings and, many of his published writings, and then I stumbled onto something, and that is that he wrote his doctoral dissertation on the poet John Donne. And in fact, here is the doctoral dissertation on my desk. A study of the poetry of John Donne, submitted to the philosophical faculty of the University of Pennsylvania by M.G. Brumbaugh, a candidate for the Doctor of Philosophy degree, the PhD. Well, Brumbaugh himself worked with poetry, and the International John Donne Society informed me that it was actually M.G. Brumbaugh who brought John Donne studies to the United States. It was this scholar of poetry who brought Donne studies to the United States of America. He never found time to publish his dissertation, and some of his friends and one of his former professors did a lot of publication on John Donne, borrowing from his work, actually citing him, not plagiarizing, citing him, because he became so involved in other things, he never found time to publish. All right, that's all I have for you this morning. So what do you want to talk about?
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Scott, it's so good to see you.
Great to see you.
Yeah. So I'm, a lot of what you're talking about is familiar. I was also lucky enough to take your Theopoetics class, and I wish I'd had a better sense of my direction while I was in seminary, because I certainly would have taken more classes with you, but that is what it is. So I'm thinking about your discussion about, many streams and this concept of metaphor. We say, well, yes, it is, but no, it's not. And you started to touch on it. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how then do we navigate, and we can be the Church of the Brethren, and we could be the United States, or other examples. How do we navigate to a place of unity or common ground? Do we need to redefine those terms? How do we find shared space that doesn't do what I see Jim Hollinger suggested in the chat, which is naming something that owns it and controls it and doesn't allow for other identification, but also feels shared, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, so it does make sense. And so, and I'm glad you named both the United States and the church. And there are different movements there that I think we need to recognize. And I think we sometimes confuse the movements when we talk about unity or even the quest for democracy. So I'm thinking right now of Amanda Gorman and her inaugural poem that surprisingly to many not only created some space for conversation, but actually brought people together in a space that transcended some of the older political divisions to at least ponder what this young African-American woman was doing in singing America. And of course, she was greatly influenced in this poem by the works of Langston Hughes, and before Langston, Walt Whitman in this notion of a democracy, a democratic space in which there's so much plurality and a lot of ambiguity, but every atom that's good in me is good in you, and somehow we must share this space and find some common metaphors that hold us together in the midst of difference and diversity. But that is in the nation state, and that's a challenge in a time when there's so much polarization. But I think it's a really noble challenge. That is the quest for a deep democracy. And in a deep democracy, we need to say, looking at democratic theories, and I could cite several books that some of you might find helpful. There is often a mistake that democracy is mere majoritarianism, or simply the strong rule by the majority. That is not the best definition of democracy or constitutional democracy. In a constitutional democracy, hospitable space is made also for dissenters in a great society, for minorities in a great society, for those whose positions differ, so that there is space, political space, geographical space, public space for persons who are not part of the majority. Now that's in a constitutional democracy, and we can say a whole lot more about that and point to some of the theorists. Now let's jump to the church, and here I think there's a great deal of I think good-willed confusion. We need to remember that the church is not a country, at least the church the way we Anabaptist pietists understand church, right? One of the things that got us into trouble, us meaning Anabaptist pietists, I'm willing to also say spiritualists and those who practiced mystic theology in the 16th and 17th century, is that we made a distinction between church and broader society. Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the small community, the larger society. We made a distinction, and we also said that the religion of the prince doesn't have to be the religion of all people. So there was a nuanced understanding of the separation of church and state, and therefore the important concept of religious voluntarism. And so I sometimes think the confusion here is that we think that the church is a whole society, and that somehow we must all either find a way to hang together and agree, or that we're somehow unfaithful. These great movements of the 16th century, 17th century and beyond, they were movements. They were not clear denominations initially with strict borders and boundaries. They were working out the principle of religious voluntarism. I really believe in religious voluntarism, and I don't think that we all have to be on the same page. And I think those who feel that they can't be part of a particular denomination for reasons of conscience or theology, belief or behavior, it is quite acceptable to follow the Spirit as they sense the leading of the Spirit and become another movement. I think we do so much damage trying to hold everyone together by finding the lowest spiritual denominator. I can tell you so many kids I know who grew up in churches where they started to feel like, oh, church is a place where we come to fight and quarrel. And I can tell you they're estranged from church. Really, it's fine to be part of other streams, of other movements, if we feel that becomes necessary, because the church, in our understanding, is more of a Gemeinschaft, a small society, rather than a Gesellschaft, a larger society. And with the principle of religious voluntarism, things can happen. I can tell you, speaking Pennsylvania, some of you know I'm affiliated with both the Church of the Brethren and the Mennonite Church USA, and I've pastored congregations on both sides of that street. When in Western Pennsylvania, the Allegheny Conference of the Mennonite Church, some congregations who were fighting for so many years decided they needed to exit. Actually, their congregations began to do better, and the other congregations began to do better. And there was an understanding around a hospitable parting where there was a recognition we could still be brothers and sisters, good family members, good neighbors, and work together, but we didn't have to be part of the same church. A long answer, Naomi, but I think I've lived this, I've seen this, and I think if we look at the empirical, experiential data in congregations, it tends to verify what I've just said. Other things?
Scott, I have a comment on M.G. Brumbaugh, if that's okay.
Yeah. Good to see you, David.
Anyone who's read his description of the birth of the church in America, that is a romanticized version. It is a poetic version, but to the best of our knowledge, also what actually happened. So he did, in fact, blend that interest in theopoetics and discovery of, what the facts were that led to the formation of the church in America. So that's kind of I'm not anti-Brumbaugh like some other people might be. I think it's a fine history that he did. So just to give you a little affirmation there.
Yeah, we had to write something together, David. I'd love to write something together, and then they could come after both of us. That'd be great.
Well, he had faults. I don't want to say that, but
of course, and you and I have faults too, right? So that's life, right? So I think, yeah, and there is a romance there, and there is a kind of romance in the best sense.
But isn't that what we want to believe about our church anyway?
It is.
I mean, he made it a temperate society when clearly that wasn't the case. So, I mean, he wanted to believe that about the early brethren, and so it was, right?
Yeah.
Let's not go on about that, though.
Well, there is something about a romantic vision, whether we're talking about the church or whether we're talking about our own domestic partner or spouse. I mean, we need to keep romance alive, right? We need to keep the best vision of our experience before us. So that's in part what faith is about. It's in part what life is about, because there's a shadow side of life that's really hard, right? And but there's grace. We're living in a world of grace, and so stepping into those spaces, I think, becomes really important.
I agree with David. Brumbaugh's history of the Brethren is a good history for its time. Just later, we got more information and we can do a better job. But for its time, I think it was a good history.
Yeah, for its time. And many would say Plato's philosophy was a good philosophy for its time, but we've moved beyond Plato. I would even say Floyd Malot's history was a good history for what he was trying to do for its time. It's incomplete. And if we would walk in my writing studio here down some steps, we would find a lot of the archives of Floyd Malott Sr. His family passed some of those things along to me because I've been very interested in all of these important conversations and these important characters that really precede us. And like all of us today, they got some things right and they got some things wrong. And we continue moving forward.
Rebecca Dali, do you have a question? I saw it, maybe you had your hand raised.
I'd like to jump in here briefly. The church perspective is much broader than just limited to Brethren and Mennonites. I've been teaching comparative religions for 30 some years. And when I moved to Masonic Village, people asked me, well, what do you really believe? And I had to indicate that I'm not just Brethren, that over the years I've practiced a number of religions. And if you really want to know what I believe, for lack of a real comprehensive position, I consider myself a bub. I was raised Brethren. I have practiced Unitarian, and I have a number of Buddhist and Taoist beliefs in my system. So I'm a Brethren Unitarian Buddhist. And I collect all of these ideas. I've really fashioned my own kind of religious perspective. So I'm really nothing, but I'm a composite of all these things. And so I think as I live and grow and practice religious principles, I find the same thing in almost every religion. There is a concept of the Ten Commandments. There are concepts of love and generosity and concern for others in all kinds of religions. And so I find most of the world's religions, at least the great religions of the world, practicing much of the same thing. And so wherever I am, when I visit a religious grouping, I can find that I can practice that particular religious faith. And so I'm a bub.
Yeah, another way to state that would be to use the poetics of Mary Oliver as well as Annie Dillard. And they have both used the phrase, I'm rather spiritually promiscuous.
I like that too.
Yeah, that might be a way of getting there, Bill, but also I think you recognize that many of those concepts, those beliefs, those behaviors, those visions, those voices, I think as you said it well, they can all probably find some place in those service cups that you know so much about and that you have collected and photographed so well. Yet there is something particular also about the service cups, right?
Right.
In terms of how it comes from a particular heritage and tradition in which you have found yourself. And so I find that really interesting to do the dance of the particular on the one hand and the universal on the other hand, and to see.
I have not left my Brethren tradition. I
know
still
you have.
have deep roots there, but I have incorporated all kinds of other things into it. I loved living in China and learning about those things. I have also loved studying other places as I have traveled around the world. And it's made my faith deeper and broader and more comprehensive. And I just love it. I'm filled with all kinds of religious perspectives.
Yeah.
I still have a good idea wherever I find it.
Yeah, I'm with you. And yeah, you mentioned the UUs. I have an essay in the current issue of the Journal of Unitarian Universalist History. A book is coming out, published by Catholics next month. I'm the only non-Roman Catholic author in that book. I have a chapter in that book. Yeah, I'm with you. But I really enjoy the kind of dance between the particular and the more universal. And we all have complicated identities. And I think celebrating those identities in their particularity and in their universality can be really important.
When I was in Florida going for my radiation treatments for prostate cancer, I sampled various religious groups that were there. I could not find a home among the Brethren in Florida, nor among the Amish that I attended, or the Mennonites. So I ended up being with the UUs. And so I found a very nice home with the Unitarians. But when I'm Other places I find a home that is comfortable for me. And it was just a nice place to shop.
So when I spoke at the UU conference in October of 2019, a number of UU scholars said they were so excited to have me there speaking because it was actually the brethren in the United States, in the Germantown Circle and Ephrata Circle, that carried universalism into the Deep South. And they asked me if I knew anything about that. And I said, tell me more. And so these scholars from Harvard, from Johns Hopkins and elsewhere pointed me to brethren who dissented from Mackite religion in Germantown, and some who had been part of Ephrata, who separated from that form of communitarianism, and they moved south and they carried with them the gospel of universal restoration. And they beat the UUs carrying that message into the South, which I didn't know anything about, quite frankly. And it's
amazing what you encounter.
that's great. Yeah, it's really great.
I saw that, oh, sorry, Scott. I think Rebecca Dali had a question.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah,
Rebecca?
I wanted to make sure that she had the opportunity to ask it. If you wanted to unmute yourself, Rebecca. Here we go.
Oh, sorry.
Are you all right?
My question, I think theologically, and I have my study in ethics and philosophy. And I come to understand that understanding of God and how individuals relate to him has been interpreted differently. And especially in our culture in Nigeria, someone will claim, without any theological education, without anything, that God have called him or her to establish a church, and he or she will gather a lot of people and claim that he has prophecy, God show it to him or her, all this. And then people will believe in him. And then there are a lot of people that are not really called by God to do all these things. They have their own different aims, but they have been involved in all this. And most of them use some mystic and poetic interpretation, although there are a lot of poetic that is wrongly interpreted, but they will claim that they are doing the word of God. So what can you say about this?
Thanks, Rebecca. That's a really important question because we don't believe every spirit. We test the spirits in a complicated conversation around texts, traditions, experiences, reasoning together in terms of a methodology. What I would say is, and this is a question that I worked with some of our mutual friends on, Rebecca, in January. I taught the course Religion as a Source of Terror or Transformation. And so a number of our friends were in the tech center there in Jos, Nigeria. And we had some really good conversations, especially around your question. And I think many of us concluded that a vision of a deep democracy of humanity and of divinity would probably conclude that we want to encourage human flourishing for everyone, and we want to prevent human cruelty. And so a model of spirituality, of theopoetics, of theology, of political science and politics would be how can we find a way to encourage human flourishing, that all might flourish, and prevent cruelty. And it's complicated. But I think with that as the kind of vision that leads us forward, which has something to do with democratizing humanity and divinity, um, it involves some, I think, interesting conversations and sometimes dialogues and debates. And sometimes it's more than mere poetry. Sometimes we are called into the mode of being prophetic in declaring a word and an action against injustice, against terror, against violence. But I think that can be underwritten by this idea of the poetic, because the poetic and the prophetic dance together, I would say, in the quest for a more inclusive, expansive understanding of God, world, self, and other.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah,
you.
thank you. We have reached the end of our time together. Scott, thank you so much for your willingness to join us this morning, for sharing. You've given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate that. Before we go, Scott, I'll give you a chance to send us off with some parting words that you might offer. But I wanted to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and we will be back together next week. Dr. Jacobson will be joining us to talk about COVID and where we're at with where we're at as far as vaccine distribution and where that is existing in society. But thank you all for joining us this morning. And Scott, would you be able to send us away?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the good conversation and for the opportunity to see old friends. It's so good to see all of you again. Let me send you off with a poem which seems appropriate. I mentioned M.G. Brumbaugh. This isn't one of his poems, but this is a poetic fragment that he found quite meaningful, and I think it sums up some of what we have been moving toward this morning. It's an old poetic fragment by John Donne. The language is masculine, and when we teach poetics, we don't change the language. We keep the language of the original poet. Most of us would use much more inclusive language. But this poetic fragment, many of you know, and it captured the intention of Brumbaugh, which is what drove him more deeply into a study of John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine's friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thanks again, and invite me back again sometime. I enjoy this. One of the great things about Zoom is I've been Zooming literally all over the world, and it's a lot of fun. So if you want to talk about any of these things further, if you want to talk about pietism, Anabaptism, one thing that might interest some of you at E-Town is some of us are convinced that the true founder of the Brethren was not Alexander Mack and his beard, but was instead Ernst Christoph Hochmann von Hochenau, who had a much more expansive understanding of the church. Love to talk to you about that sometime.
All right, I will take that into consideration. Thanks, Scott. I heard you say it, so we're gonna have to have you back now.
Well, I published in this area. It's actually in the new publication entitled Brethren, Intersections, History, Identity, Cross Currents, which comes out of the Brethren World Assembly. And I even have some members of the old orders, German Baptist Brethren, who are corresponding with me since this. They find it fascinating. I find it fascinating. It's very particular though. It really fits in the service cup.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Go in peace. We'll see you. Bye.
Take care.